topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, hello and welcome. Bill Martinez here. Great to have you with us. For more information on the show, you can check it out, BillMartinezShow.com. The controversy continues, no doubt. 2020 election, you've got numbers that look like still, what, 80%, over 80% of Republicans believe that there were shenanigans in the 2020 election. Their lack of confidence about what happened in 2020 still looms. Independents now, 61%, according to some surveys. Even Democrats now, a majority of Democrats are saying there's just something about what happened in the elections that leave us in a quandary. Our next guest has taken on to prove something that with all his experience, and I mean this, I mean, he has such a breadth of experience in tackling this topic. It is something that we could only hope that our government would have done. And in this particular case, it was Donald Trump who hired Ken Block to look into the 2020 election to find out, what the heck happened. His book subsequently has been the result of what you might say, maybe 3 years of research, plus a lifetime of experience that's wrapped into this book called Disproven, My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud for the Trump Campaign, the data that shows why he lost and how we can improve our elections. Ken Block, welcome to the show. Good to have you with us.
Bill, thank you for having me on.
I've been so looking forward to this because we've had a lot. I mean, in our search, where we come from here, Ken, we're pursuing the truth. We want people to understand what's going on. Unfortunately, today's journalism outlets and that sadly seem to be biased and prejudiced, and there's few and fewer outlets available that are open to take these topics on at the risk of, in some cases, social media canceling. I've been put in social media jail a couple of times because I believe I have I just have a mandate from our audiences. Bill, find us the truth, check it out, and so I appreciate you coming on the show to help us get to, the bottom of all this, because as I mentioned, these numbers, when you've got these huge numbers of Americans, the voter, the electorate saying, hey, I don't know what to believe about this election, that's a sad commentary where we are in this democratic republic, don't you think?
100%. The number of people who believe that somehow the elections were rigged is extraordinary. I was asked by the Trump campaign simply to look for fraud sufficient to change the results of one of the swing state elections. Mm-hmm. And they also asked me to evaluate claims of voter fraud as they rolled into the campaign just for the month after the election in 2020.
Ken, how do you do that? Because, on one hand, you've got a former attorney general under Barack Obama who said that voter fraud doesn't exist. So you got that, that perception on one side. And then the other side, let's just say, for lack of another name, Sidney Powell, that, we got cracking all over the place. Yeah. So, this is the extremes of the perception. And so this is not something, that I think that you can just, say, okay, I'm going to go in and if I can prove these 3 or 4 things, then maybe I can get to the bottom of this, is the way I look at it. But of course, that's in my own neophyte way. You're the expert. You know the numbers and you know how to do this. You've been doing this for a long time. So help us understand how you approach this to where what you're sharing with us right now, we can say, okay, maybe we can start to get some peace and understanding as to what happened in 2020.
Sure. So in my background, very quickly, I've been looking at voter data, not just in my home state of Rhode Island, but across the country for a decade. I was one of the first people to really start looking in 2014 at people who voted twice. I found people who lived in very fancy homes in Newport, Rhode Island, who were voting in Rhode Island and also from their very fancy home addresses in Palm Beach, Florida, for example.
Right.
So, that's sort of how I started getting into it. Over the decade that went by, we became experts at identifying deceased voters, understanding very clearly how different states put their voter data together. I was asked to present to former President Trump's Election Integrity Commission in 2017. I went up to Manchester, New Hampshire, and helped, and I discussed the results of research that I did for the Government Accountability Institute, where I discovered roughly 8,000 to 9,000 duplicate votes that were cast by voters across 24 different states. And that included 2,200 duplicate votes that were cast in Florida. And as my company developed this expertise, we began to get, we were asked to participate in doing the data analytics for lawsuits. And
Right.
that's a really different animal than just doing it as a hobby. You have to, when you find results that are going to be behind a lawsuit, your results are going to be attacked by the opposing side's experts, and you'd better have your act together or else they'll destroy you, and then you have nothing. So not only
Ken Block, let me interject this real quick.
Yeah.
So as early as 2017, the Trump campaign gets a hold of you to look into voter fraud.
Actually, it was Vice President Pence's chief of staff who reached out to me because he was in charge of the Presidential Voter Integrity Commission at the time.
Yes.
I went down. I spent the day in the vice president's office with his staff and other members of the commission, and subsequently was asked to present in Manchester some of the work that we have done in the past. So I am no stranger to it. And most importantly, as we work our way into this conversation, my data has survived legal scrutiny. I have helped people and organizations sue secretaries of state because they weren't properly maintaining voter data. I have helped states fend off lawsuits against them where the lawsuit was centered on data, and I was able to do the analytics and have my analytics survive the scrutiny of the opposing side's experts. So, I am very good we're very good at what we do. And when the Trump campaign reached out to me, it was originally a simple ask of me. They wanted me and my company to determine if voter fraud impacted any of the 6 swing states in 2020. And they wanted me to look specifically for deceased voters. And they asked me to look for duplicate votes that were cast by somebody in the swing state and also in any other state in the country, basically.
Ken Block, real quick. Ken Block is with us in his book, Disproven. Ken is an expert in voter data. And there's so much, to your career. You've run for office. I think you've run for governor twice there in Rhode Island, right?
I did.
Well, good for you. Well, you've activated your citizenship and you are fervent about maintaining this democratic republic. So, God bless you and your team, for looking out for America, because, there's just something, I don't know, inherently, culturally upsetting about where we are right now. Here we are, you and I are talking days after the president of the United States, former President Donald Trump, has been indicted on 34 counts, felony counts, which is unprecedented and unheard of. And, part of me is thinking that, what could happen here? Are there going to be other states that are going to follow the lead of this nuclear bomb that was let off in New York, kind of like a Harry Reid nuclear bomb that he let off in the Senate, if you remember, regarding the filibuster. And it was that nuclear weapon that he unleashed that, that gave us 3 conservative judges in the Supreme Court, right?
Yep. 100%. So, it's, the time that we live in right now is so extraordinarily hyperpartisan. I worry about it from the viewpoint of we are a single country that's largely divided along political lines right now. And we have to figure out how to jump over that divide to get things done. I ran for governor because I wanted to get things done in my corrupt, broken little state of Rhode Island that's been run by Democrats for close to 90 years. And we have pension deficits that are extraordinary. I could go on and on about the problems that Rhode Island has. I'm a guy who rolls up his sleeves and wants to get in there and fix it. And I don't know how we ever overcome where we're at right now with the political divide. But for sure, sharing my experience in what I was asked to do for the Trump campaign, what we found and what we determined is a very, very important piece of information. And just so everybody understands, the reason I'm talking about it at all is because my communications with the Trump campaign were subpoenaed by Jack Smith's grand jury a year ago in DC. My communications were subpoenaed by Ruby Freeman's legal team, who was the black election worker in Atlanta, Georgia, who Rudy Giuliani defamed. And I've also been subpoenaed by Fani Willis's legal action in Fulton County, Georgia. So I've become, not through any desire on my part to be one, a professional recipient of subpoenas. I don't like it. But now that all of my materials are in all three of those different parties' hands, I realized I'd better tell the story on the straight up and up and not let somebody else do it for me.
Well, exactly. Well, you're getting hit with subpoena. This gets to be expensive. I mean, do you have a legal war chest in order to fend off all this stuff?
Oh, I didn't fend it off. When you receive,
well, when I say fend it off, that was the wrong word. I meant, to answer. You've got to answer these subpoenas.
I do have to answer, and I have a long time personal and corporate attorney, and I had to pay him to make sure that we did everything precisely the right way, and we buttoned everything up, because you can get yourself into some deep water quickly if you don't respond carefully. And we responded very carefully and transparently, because there isn't any other option when you get a subpoena like these.
Well, especially as you say right now, I mean, the partisanship in our country is so filled with rancor, is that, boy, if you can be, attacked in any way, if there's a chink in your armor, if there's any avoidance of the truth at any level, boy, they're going to find it and exploit it and invalidate you in a heartbeat, right?
Yeah. I mean, as I got into politics in 2010, I was complaining then about what partisanship looked like and how bad it was, but that was a piece of cake compared to what we got now, right? I mean, it's extraordinarily bad. I really desperately wish it wasn't, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans.
Exactly.
And at some point, we may be all called to come together quickly to solve a problem, and we got to be able to do so.
Well, is it going to take another 9/11, some national catastrophe, or is there, some leader that's going to be able to kind of, grab the moral consciousness, so to speak, of the country and, kind of shake the sense into us in such a way? Because, we've been on this journey for, a couple of decades, and it seems to be getting worse, not necessarily getting better.
It's definitely getting worse. I look back to when Tip O'Neill, who was a Democratic speaker in Congress, was well known for taking folks from across the aisle, Republicans, out, having drinks at the bar. I mean, that's right. We need to get back to that. We need to get back to a situation where, instead of taking shots at each other, means literally, verbal attack and that kind of thing, the shots we should be taking with each other should be at a bar and enjoying ourselves a little bit.
Well, I'm for that. Without a doubt, it would definitely be more palpable, for the citizens of this country, because we're the ones, at the end of the day, Ken Block, we're the ones that are paying for it, are we not?
100%. It's going to require leadership on both sides of the aisle to pull it together and to move us from where we are right now. And I am holding my breath, waiting for the right set of leaders to come along to make that happen.
Well, you and me both. I think sometimes what happens is you just have to, get the fight out of you. It's almost like somebody drowning. I grew up in the West Coast on the beaches, And lifeguards were taught very early that when somebody was out there drowning, you didn't go in and save them right away. Of course, it freaks those of us who have compassion out because we're going, hello, guy drowning, woman drowning. And they, oh, yeah, we see. It's okay. And what do you mean it's okay? They're drowning. Well, they knew from experience and training that they had to get the fight out of themselves. And once they got the fight out of themselves, then they could be, much easier to contain and saved. Otherwise, if they went in and tried to save them right away, then both of them became at risk, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah. So maybe that's the way we are right now, politically speaking. Yes, it's tough. And, for those of us who observe this and we see what's going on and see that it's no benefit to anybody. I mean, we're $35 trillion in debt. Our borders are wide open. National security is compromised. Cost of living is through the roof. How is that serving we the people, Ken Block?
Yeah, well, I crazily, I live in one of the highest tax states in the country. And, so I fully understand, and I push back hard against not only the inefficiencies of my government here in Rhode Island, but the non-professionalism of so many who serve in Rhode Island in government. It's a problem. I think it's a problem across the board. And again, I don't really have an answer at the federal level on what the right thing to do is, but what we can't afford to do. I'm a very fiscally conservative individual.
Right.
What we need to do is we need to make sure that we're not jeopardizing the livelihoods and the financial security of our grandchildren.
Right.
Right now, it's at risk because of what we're doing with the deficit and that sort of thing. And we should be doing far better than we are.
Well, I believe that local is what feeds into the national. It happened in this time and time again. Local, can make the changes much quicker, and ultimately it will affect the national level. But we have serious problems, as you know, and you've witnessed, on a federal level, and but that doesn't take away from the foundation of this great country. We've got a great country. You and I have been so blessed to be raised in this country, and we want our kids and our grandkids to have that same opportunity, right?
100%.
Yeah, I'm right with you. Well, we're talking with Ken Block, his book, Disproven, My Unbiased Search. And he means that with all sincerity, and I believe him to be true. I mean, it is an unbiased search, something that we needed for voter fraud for the Trump campaign, the data that shows why Trump lost and how we can improve our elections. So, Ken, break it down for us. What did you discover as you were first hired, by Mike Trump's advisory committee to look into voter fraud?
You're talking about what I did in 2017 or what I did in 2020?
2020. I'm sorry. I referenced 2017. So I understood. Yeah. I'm sorry for the confusion. No, sure. Subsequent when Trump's team said, hey, help us understand. You're the expert. What went on?
Yeah. So it ended up being two different things I did for them. My contract asked me to look for evidence of dead voters and duplicate voters sufficient to have changed an election result in any swing state. And my findings had to survive legal scrutiny. Was
that a fair question, Ken? Was that a fair question to pose at that point?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Look, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to look at voter rolls and determine who's dead and who's not. And it's even harder to determine if two people with the same name and the same date of birth voting in two different states is the same person or a different person. Right. It's very, very hard. We know how to do it. It's not cheap. And it had never, this is really important. I'm not aware of any presidential campaign ever auditing essentially the results of a national election. That's what the Trump campaign asked my company to do. And we had all of 35 days to do it, because what a lot of people don't understand is that the legal window to contest an election result starts on election night and it ends the day each state certifies its election results. And most states have certified their results by the end of the first week of December.
Well, so with that deadline, how much of a problem is that?
Well, it's a substantial challenge, and to really do the analysis, the justice that it deserves, you can't start working on it the day after the election like I was asked to do. You really need to have an operation that's done all kinds of work months ahead of election day, so that you have a big head of steam going. You know exactly all the data you're going to be looking at, and you can save weeks of effort by doing a lot of work in advance. We didn't have that luxury. That I didn't get the phone call until the day after the election, and so we basically jumped in hard, and it was an insane 35 days.
Well, it had to been even from the start, because you got, chain of custody issues right off the bat, don't you?
So we took all of the voter data directly from the Republican National Committee's data. They call it a data lake. It's just a big computer with lots of data in it. And all of the files that we looked at came directly from state or county governments. Okay. So from a chain of custody perspective, I was pretty comfortable that the data that we had was what it needed to be. I've looked at most states' data in the past. The data looked the same for all the different data that we looked at from the 6 states of interest that we looked at. And it probably warrants saying the names: Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania.
The infamous swing states, right? Exactly.
Yep, the swing states. So, this chain of custody was solid. There were so many challenges in just getting into it and getting going. And then on top of that, so I was contractually obligated to do our own digging for fraud. And the day after I signed the contract, the lawyer I reported to, whose name was Alex Cannon, we talked first thing in the morning often, and I'm talking like 6 a.m., 5:30 sometimes. And I got the early morning phone call from Alex, my first of what turned out to be many. And he said, "Hey, I've got a claim in Pennsylvania where I have a spreadsheet of 100 names they claim were dead voters. Can you tell me what's going on with that?" So that was the first request. And what he was asking me to do, just so everybody is clear, he was asking me to perform due diligence on the claim, because what he was asked to do was take this claim to court if the claim was valid. And he was asking me to do his due diligence, vet the file, and tell him if it was a good result or a bad result. And he brought me 15, 20 claims over the course of those 30 days. Yes. Most of them on an emergency basis. Drop everything you're doing and look at this. We have to file a lawsuit tomorrow if it's true. And I was able to look at them and unfortunately tell him time after time after time after time, nope, this one is wrong. Here's why this one is wrong. Here's why this one is wrong. And the way our interactions went, the early requests were, tell me whether this one is right or wrong. By the end of the whole thing, he was just saying, tell me why this one is wrong, because everybody were making mistakes. A lot of people were well-intentioned. A lot of people, by the way, I wanted to be the person to find massive fraud if it existed, right? I mean, if we have a big time problem with our elections, I wanted to be the guy to unearth it. It simply wasn't there in terms of findings that would have stood up in court and survived legal scrutiny. And this is the whole key to all of the talking that we do as a nation about our elections. Right. The only conversations that are worth having about voter fraud are the provable claims that will stand up in court, because any other claim doesn't matter. It can't ever impact what the results of the election were. And so that's the long and the short of it. That's why when the last of the swing states certified their results, my job was over. There was no role for me at that point because there was no hope of being successful in court.
Well, of all the things that were questioned, you run into the mathematical calculus that says 100 votes. Well, you lost by 12,000. So what? So now you're kind of like Don Quixote chasing windmills, because unless you can get the mother lode and demonstrate that there were, hundreds of thousands of votes that are involved here. I mean, you've got, I think there were like something like I thought there was 1,000. I think at one time there were 1,000 sworn affidavits from poll watchers saying, hey, there's a problem here in River City. I don't understand. I'll swear to it that the whole truth, nothing but that this is what I observed. And that number since has risen to 7,000. So you get into the perception versus reality issue here. But I can see in some cases where if you're talking 100 votes, big whoop, it doesn't matter. Because
you're right. So this was in Pennsylvania where the margin of victory was 90,000 votes.
Right.
But I looked at them and it turned out that the person who had done the analysis made a bunch of mistakes. Almost all of the votes that were identified were in 2020 in Pennsylvania. It was legal. The vote was allowed to be counted if you voted early and then unfortunately died before the election. Almost all of the 100 votes were either a legally valid vote because the voter cast the vote while alive, but then died before election day. Or in some circumstances, the person didn't understand that you can have two people with the same name and same date of birth. It doesn't mean they're the same person. It usually means it's somebody else. So that's another classic mistake that I saw over and over and over again. But we found one out of 100 that was actually questionable because the date of birth and the receipt by the board of elections of that mail ballot overlapped by only like a day. So it could have been fraud. It could have been it is an allowable vote. There was no smoking gun with that one. You mentioned 100,000 or more votes. I got one claim like that. This one is by far my favorite claim to talk about.
Okay, but before we do, let me do this because I got to remind everybody. We're talking to the world famous Ken Block. He's becoming world famous now.
Not as famous as the race car driver, by the way.
As we say so, he's an expert in voter data, a technology entrepreneur, two-time candidate for governor, advocate for good government, and founder of the centrist political party, author of the book Disproven, My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud, and the Trump campaign, the data that shows why he lost and how we can improve our elections. All right, so let's pick up the story. Talk about your favorite 100,000 vote story.
Yeah, it was actually 740,000 votes.
Whoa, okay.
In early December, Alex called me and said, check your email. I got one. You have to tell me why it's wrong. There were some folks in Wisconsin who had done their own analysis and determined that 740,000 Wisconsin voters had voted twice. They couldn't make the numbers add up of what they had done with what the Secretary of State was announcing for the total number of votes cast. They came up 740,000 votes short, assumed it must be because of duplicate votes. They wanted the Department of Justice to come in. They took their findings to a friend of theirs who played golf, who brought it to the manager of a Trump golf course, who brought it to Eric Trump, who brought it to the Oval Office, who gave it to Alex Cannon, who gave it to me and said, you need to tell me why it's wrong. And I quickly, I understood almost immediately the mistake that they had made. The file of data they were looking at only had mail ballots in it. It didn't have in-person votes, cast votes by people who went on election day to vote. And the number of votes that they were off by was basically the number of in-person votes that were cast in Wisconsin. And I was able to, that was probably the easiest one that I had to disprove. And then that was it, but it was, people get really excited when it comes to trying to provide the proof to back up the claim that voter fraud surrounds us everywhere. I am probably the only person in this country who predicted mail ballot fraud before it happened.
Jimmy Carter, back in the 80s, 1989, he and who was the senator, the two-man commission that they led, said mail-in balloting was going to be a nightmare. It was a way to vote for voter fraud.
Yeah, well, it turns out I was doing a court case in September, October, November of 2020 in Pennsylvania. And as I was looking at the voter rolls, and we were looking for evidence of deceased voters on the rolls, and I had discovered about 21,000 of them. One of them in particular caught my eye because this woman had registered to vote in September of 2020. She had died in 2013. And I looked at that and I said, the timing of that registration and the whole thing about this, you watch, this will become a fraudulent deceased vote. That prediction found its way into the court record in the court case. And it turns out that on the day it went into the record, the mail ballot had been cast in that dead woman's name by her, I believe it was her widowed husband. And now the vote ridiculously counted in that election. Even though election workers were aware this had been identified as a likely fraudulent vote, they didn't do anything about it. It was a vote that was counted after the election. The guy's name was Presto.
Right.
He was arrested, charged, and he pled guilty to committing voter fraud. So, there are anybody who says there's no such thing as voter fraud is wrong and has been wrong for as long as we've had computerized records that you can research.
Yeah. Even before then, Ken, I was looking back, and I mean, going back to 1700, there was indication of voter fraud taking place. I mean, there's just something about the human condition. It just somehow we have inbred in us that it's acceptable to cheat, even in golf. But that's a whole nother story.
Just to talk to that point, people will cheat if they believe they can get away with it. If it's a low risk crime, they're much more likely to do it than if it's a high risk crime.
Right.
And voter fraud used to be a low risk crime. It was very difficult to do the kind of analysis. It still remains difficult doing the kind of stuff I'm talking about,
Right.
But people are doing it now. We have done it. And states, even though I understand the reasons, for your listeners who are aware of it, those who aren't, there's this thing called ERIC, capital ERIC. And without getting in deep into the mess that thing is, what they're trying to do is very important. The different states who are members pool their data together, trying to identify people who are registered to vote in different states, because since each state manages its own voter data, it's very hard without something like ERIC in the middle to determine if somebody has multiple voter registrations in multiple states. ERIC became very political. All the way it was political from the day it got started. There needs to be something else to replace it. Frankly, I think that the Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal nonpartisan organization, should do that function. So there's no partisanship to it. There's nothing to it other than helping states get their data clean. It's hard to have integrity in our elections when the data that sits underneath those elections is dirty.
Exactly.
And man, we have dirty data. Now, dirty data doesn't mean fraud is happening everywhere. Okay. Voter fraud is a 5-year prison term felony on top of a $10,000 fine. It used to be you could do it. No one was even aware that you were doing it. Who cares? Now there's lots of people watching. And I believe that's driven down the number of people willing to risk committing a felony moving forward. But let's talk. Your listeners will love this. So in New Jersey, and I got to say, before I say this, it's not evidence of voter fraud. It's sloppy data, but not voter fraud. There are 25,000 registered voters in New Jersey with a year of birth of 1800. 8,000 of them voted in 2020. Okay. But that's not fraud. That's election workers not cleaning up the fact that those voters' registration records didn't have a date of birth. If 8,000 people are voting with a year of 1800, you can get their year of birth from them, right? Yeah. You can get it by
who gave them that birthday.
So that's what the default in their computer system is. If it doesn't have a date of birth, right? So same problem in New York. In fact, New York has some of the worst data that I've ever seen, ever. Right? So there are lots of things that we should be doing to clean up the data. but that also doesn't stop a small amount of voter fraud from happening.
Right.
Wrapping up my engagement with the Trump campaign, every claim they brought to me, I was able to show them why it was false, including claims brought by college professors, PhDs, using really complicated mathematical theories to prove that voter fraud was everywhere in Pennsylvania, for example.
Right. Exactly.
I had 24 hours to prove them wrong, and I did. And it doesn't give
it wasn't so much that you were trying to prove them wrong. You were just trying to just do the analysis, right? I mean, I want people to understand it wasn't like you were sitting there like you had skin in the game one way or another. I mean, you went and approached this from an objective viewpoint. I sense, right?
So what I was doing was the due diligence that the lawyers that I reported to asked me to do. They didn't want to walk a claim into court that was false.
Exactly.
Right? So my job.
We know what happened to some attorneys that did that.
Correct.
It didn't fare well for them.
They fared terribly. So my job, when I was asked to evaluate all these claims of voter fraud, was to protect the lawyers who were going to bring the claim into court, because the only thing, there's nothing worse than filing a lawsuit that has at its foundation false data, and the other side's experts point it out and blow you out of the water. It's humiliating.
Exactly.
So my job was to prevent the humiliation. And like I said, it doesn't give me great glee to say it, but the cold truth is that none of the claims that was given to me to evaluate passed muster. None of them would have survived their day in court.
Right. Well, I do want to clear up something. I said 1989. It was actually 2005. And it was James Baker and President Carter that did the investigation into mail-in voting. And their conclusion was that mail-in voting was ripe with potential fraud. So here it is. So everything that you did mathematically, that your company analyzed, and the bottom line was you could not see and discern and conclude any wholesale voter fraud. However, Ken, after everything is all said and done, why is it? And I don't believe it's just because Donald Trump. I mean, the mainstream media want to say, well, because Donald Trump keeps beating the drum of voter fraud. I mean, Stacey Abrams beat that drum forever. She lost by 80,000 votes, and I think she still beats that drum. But nobody believes her. But for Donald Trump, these numbers, like I mentioned when we first started talking, you got over 80% of Republicans not having their faith in the 2020 election, 61 independents, 61%, over 50% now of Democrats. So we've got a disconnect between, perception and reality. I would say that, my wife and I were traveling across country. We went through 12 states in October leading into the election. And, I've been a marketing guy all my life. And I have a sense for momentum. And, I saw this happen with Barack Obama, for example. His campaign, you said, wow, this guy's got such wind at his back. And he's just, he's got a lot of momentum in his campaign. And this is the same thing that I witnessed with Donald Trump, going into the 2020 election. I went through 12 states and I saw Trump signs, Trump Pence signs everywhere I went. And I counted just out of curiosity. I said, I got to make a note. And guess how many signs for Biden Harris I saw through 12 states. And we're not just going through, through red states. I mean, we're going through, mostly blue states, including Los Angeles. And ask me how many signs for Biden Harris that I saw going through 12 states.
Right.
Three. I saw three.
I believe you.
I saw three. So the perception of momentum and all that's going on. And then you have the president, even with the count, getting 10 million more votes than he got previously, which is unheard of. I've never heard of president getting 10 million, the incumbent president getting 10 million more votes, but losing by a record number from a politician. By comparison, Barack Obama didn't even get those numbers, So,
right. So there's a very interesting document on the website politico.com. And Trump's pollster is a guy named Tony Fabrizio. And I know Tony. Tony did my polling in 2014. Last time I talked to him was 2016 or so. He was asked by the Trump campaign to do exit polling in all the swing states in 2020. And what an exit poll is they have workers standing outside the polling places, interviewing people as they leave the polling place.
Right.
Who did you vote for? Why did you vote that way? Blah, blah, blah. And Fabrizio, in an internal campaign document that was leaked, came up with the following findings. So this comes directly from Trump's pollster. It's not my data. It's no one else's data. It's very expensive data that came right from the guy. 1 out of 6 voters that they interviewed, out of 30,000 voters that they interviewed across the swing states, 1 out of 6 were first-time voters who came out to vote against President Trump. And the reason they did so, to me, is bonkers. They did so, they said, because of COVID. Okay, that's a big number, big percentage of the votes. They all had the same, more or less, same explanation for it.
So they were blaming Trump for COVID?
I think they didn't like the way he handled COVID. I don't know the particulars of it, and like I said, I think it's a little crazy, but voters sometimes vote for crazy reasons anyway, right? You know, having run for office, it's so depressing sometimes for what motivates people to vote.
So,
and why.
So not only when you run for office, not only do you need an attorney and a pollster, you need a therapist.
You do afterwards. You do. It took me
It
took me a long time to recover from both runs, and that's in a small state. Another 1 out of 6 voters were, and I'm going to use Trump's term for them, were rhinos.
Okay.
Who were lifelong Republicans, they told the exit polls, but they voted against Trump in 2020. Trump lost them. In fact, Trump told them to take a hike in so many words, right? You know, we know that President Trump has no love for rhinos. So, you know, that's a third of the people they interviewed, brand new voters and loss of Republican support. And in Fabrizio's dialogue about those findings, he talked about the loss of Republican support as a crucially important element that contributed to the actual loss that they experienced in the swing states. So now and I understand that the way I think and the way former President Trump thinks could be very, very different. But if I was in his shoes, I would try to figure out how to bring those voters back, because his own pollster told him they had such a negative impact on the results in 2020. That hasn't happened yet. I watch and listen pretty carefully. And I think that's a problem that the campaign has that they have to resolve before Election Day. Now, fortunately for the Republicans, Biden has his own loss of Democratic support right now in young progressives who I guess they believe they're going to penalize Biden for the Israel-Gaza problem by not voting for Biden, and therefore, in effect, casting a vote for Trump. You know, so there's a lot of unknowns as we roll into the election. And what I would just ask everybody to do is take a breath. If there truly was monumental fraud, it would be dealt with. It would surface. We would all come to an agreement it's a problem. And by the way, things like ballot harvesting should be made illegal across the country.
100%.
No doubt about it. Why? How can our presidential elections hinge on a bunch of people running around collecting ballots? That's wrong all the way, right? Gerrymandering is wrong, right? When we start new democracies around the world, I guarantee you we don't take the practice of gerrymandering and tell them you ought to do this because it's good for democracy, right? It's not good for democracy. So there are when I put my good government hat on, there's like a dozen things that we could talk about for changes that we should make that would make our elections stronger, fairer, and a level playing field. Getting rid of gerrymandering, getting rid of ballot harvesting, putting a formal government database together to help all the states clean up their data, right? I could go on and on and on about it.
Well, I know
the most important part of the book.
Yeah, I know that one of the things you talked about was shortening up the number of days I believe there should just be a national day for voting. Everybody takes the day off. It's a federal day off. It's one of those federal holidays that I would agree with. We've got so many of our federal employees. They had so many holidays. It's not even funny. But this one, I wouldn't have a big problem in adding, is that you take the day off, you have a day off, you go ahead and vote. And then afterwards, you come together as Americans and we celebrate and said, hey, we did our deal. I don't care about you voting for Republican or Democrat. It's just, hey, look we all got skin in the game. We participated. We exercised our civic responsibility. And let's see who the next president is. And, what I find quite interesting, Ken, is that in primaries, we're able to get this information by midnight in all these different states. But when it comes to a federal election, all of a sudden it gets so complicated. And, we need days and weeks to, add the numbers. What's going on?
Right. So we're in the most complicated element of election law, talking about mail ballots. One of the big problems I think we have in our elections is the fact that the states can, to a large extent, conduct the elections however they want. Mm-hmm. And what that means in practical terms is for the swing states in 2024, the shortest mail ballot window is 27 days. The longest one is 60 days.
Yeah, crazy.
Right? And I look at that, and as a computer guy, I want them to all be the same number of days, mm-hmm. right? We talked early on about allegedly dead voters in Pennsylvania, and how many of them cast their votes early and then died before Election Day. Well, it turns out that in a third of the states, the state allows those sorts of votes. In a third of the states, the state disallows those sort of votes. And in fact, in Michigan in 2020, they disallowed 3,500 votes where the voter voted early and then died before Election Day. That's not a small number of votes.
No, that's a lot of votes.
And in the other third of the states, there's no law about this circumstance at all, even though it has to happen. So that's a mess, right? How can we have a different outcome for these voters depending on where they live? It should be the same experience for all of them. We should either make them all count or make them all not count. For me, because it's so hard to determine that a voter is deceased or not, I say that we should let them count, because determining that they can't count is crazily, crazily hard, especially if they pass away just a few days before the election.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is, yeah.
So, and actually, I think, here we go. Here's the first chance for a compromise.
Right.
Nationwide, make those votes count, but as part of the compromise, make sure that the mail ballot window is only 2 weeks in length or less. Mm-hmm. Right? Both sides get something, both sides lose something.
You're a technology guy. What do you make? I mean, there's so much controversy over these voting machines. I thought maybe as a grand experiment, maybe we have a couple of, couple states do a dual process. We do the voting machines and then we do a ballot. And that way we could, have something in which to gauge, to say that, these machines are really, they're viable. I think it was, the problem I had was when, they went to the Hill, I'm talking about Dominion specifically, and they were asked whether or not there was internet connectivity. And the CEO said, absolutely not. And then they find a modem in the machines. So, again, this is the stuff that gives people doubts and, about this whole process. So I'm going to let you address that, summarize everything and wrap things up because we've got about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to give you the floor. Okay.
Sure. So repeating what I said previously, when it comes to voter fraud, people can often get mixed up between fraud and integrity issues that have dirty data and other things behind them, but they're bad, but they're not evidence of fraud. Mm-hmm. Fraud is something that you can verify and quantify. And unless you can do that with some of the claims that people are talking about, you're really not talking about fraud. As somebody who's run for office, as somebody who was paid, frankly, a great deal of money to look at the 2020 election and to help the Trump campaign, if it was able to be done, we weren't able to do it. It was a straight up assessment. That's what the lawyers wanted. The lawyer I reported to accepted my evidence as true. Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff at the time, accepted that as truth when Alex Cannon told him the voter fraud that everyone wants us to find simply isn't there.
Exactly. Well, Ken Block, thank you so much for being with us. He's the author of Disproven, My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud for the Trump Campaign, the data that shows why he lost and how we can improve our election. That's, again, and I can't overemphasize enough, and you mentioned it, Ken, that your insight and your suggestions on how to improve our elections is a critical part of this book and a must read. So again, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Bill.
Well, it was the day after the 2020 presidential election. A lawyer for former U.S. President Donald Trump's campaign called Ken Block, a registered Republican and former gubernatorial candidate for Rhode Island, and asked if his firm, Simpatico Software Systems, would look for voter fraud. Block knew somebody was going to do it, and he knew he could do it honestly, thoroughly, and impartially. So he took on the job, and it's all right here in this book, Disproven. Thank you, Ken Block, and thank you for sharing a part of your day with us. May God bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you, and may he give you peace. Thanks again for being with us. God bless.